Hey, welcome again to 7 at 7. I'm glad that you're here. We've been taking a deep dive on some tough topics. We're continuing today to talk a little bit about suffering, how we manage it, and how we help others to do the same. And we've got a special guest today, Dr. Jennifer Fast. Looking forward to you meeting her and for the conversation that's ahead. Well, again, welcome to 7 at 7, and this is Dr. Jennifer Fast. She is a clinical psychologist. She does fantastic work all across the Metroplex. She oversees over 60 couples. It's a part of Stanford Couples Counseling. And I'm excited to have her with us. They're members of our church family, and if you don't know her, you ought to make an opportunity to say hello. But today, we're going to talk about suffering in particular, and I'm so excited that you're here to be with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, as we begin, one of the things I want to talk about is that when suffering goes bad. I know that this is something that you've studied, you see it with a lot of patients through the years. Talk to me about some things that happen when suffering doesn't go right or people internalize in a way that's not healthy.
Yeah, we often see with suffering, people generally will kind of turn inwards to themselves. They will isolate. They stop engaging in relationships that are important to them, whether that's their significant other, their family, their friends. And I think one of the hardest things to see is when people who are really suffering when they turn to substances. So we see a lot with addiction. Those individuals are really struggling. I mean, they're really suffering at a deep level, and they're using those substances to try to cope. But those are generally some of the things that we see. Often a lot of depression, anxiety goes with that.
Yeah. You know, I've noticed through the years, and I think I've even read some studies that show that like couples that go through significant suffering with their children, maybe long hospitalizations or even the loss of a child, often their marriages don't make it.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about what you see that's happening in that dynamic that maybe causes that to take place.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even imagine going through that. You know, I have 2 kids, and you can think about it, and just even thinking about it is just so painful, you know, the loss of a child. But what we do see with couples who do lose a child, and they really struggle to communicate their grief. Like that pain is so significant for them as a couple, as a family, but as individual people. And sometimes, again, with that, like turning inwards rather than turning towards one another, which is what you really want to have happen when you're going through something like that. So they turn inwards. And I think sometimes one of the partners feels like they have to be really strong, and they don't get a chance to really express their grief, talk about their grief, because they're trying to either take care of their partner or take care of the other children that might be there. Or for both of them, they're like, we have all these other things that need to be taken care of. We don't have time for this, and you have to make time for grief. And I think one of the probably more tragic things that sometimes comes up when there's a loss of a child is a parent might blame their spouse for it. And so if there's blame, like, you know, if they think that their husband or wife should have been more present or asked more questions or not taken them to that place or like whatever it is, that blame can be very difficult to get past, and it breeds anger and resentment, and again, that turning away from one another rather than towards one another.
We're going to talk about the grief cycle a little bit tomorrow, but one of the things, too, that I often see happen is that one of the members of the couple, or maybe both of them, are working through grief in a way they haven't ever had to before, and they begin to think the other partner should be working it out in the same way. So why aren't you crying more? Or why aren't you as upset as me? Or why are you crying all the time? Or, you know, whatever. And they interpret the lack of sameness in their grief as something that's problematic, or it's inferior, or something in the other person.
Absolutely. And there's no one right way to grieve other than allowing for the grieving process to happen. But we all grieve in different ways. You know, for those that have never experienced death or tragedy, it can be incredibly overwhelming. For those that maybe have had multiple experiences of that, they kind of have a way that works for them, and so they may not be as verbal or as expressive. And some people don't want to do that in front of others. They prefer to do that behind closed doors in their own time. But the only right way to grieve is to allow for the grieving process to happen. But there's not a number of tears that should be shed or, any sort of, like right way of expressing it.
Yeah, and I think that there's such a need for solidarity, like we're in this together. And then when all of a sudden kind of the grief pathways diverge, then you begin to have this extra tension on top of all the other things that are already happening. Right?
Yes.
I in my premarital counseling talks with couples, I tell them about this time that when we were in Loma Linda, we were in the Ronald McDonald House, and it was a beautiful place, but the walls were very thin. Like maybe the volunteer carpenters hadn't heard of insulation. And so we could hear everything going on in both sides of us in the rooms that were beside us. And of course, in that environment, you got a child in the hospital, everybody's very stressed out. But one day in particular, Julie was at the hospital and I was back at the room by myself for whatever reason, and I heard this fight break out in the room beside us between this couple. And my heart just broke over them. But I was aware that they were saying things to each other that they could never take back. And they probably wouldn't have said those things if they hadn't been under the stress that they were under. But whatever the case, this is what happened. And so now the suffering is compounded because you've added this other piece.
Yes. Suffering makes us do and say things that we might not normally do and say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so if you were talking to somebody today who was entering into a season of suffering or preparing for one they don't even know is on the horizon yet, like what are 3 or 4 things that you might say? Like these are key things to keep in mind as you step into a season of suffering.
I think number 1, know who your support system is. Let people in. If you've not already let people in, let them in. Let them know what's going on for you in your life. And if you don't have a support system in place, find one. You've always talked about, and just this last Sunday, you talked about having a life group and how powerful that can be to have a group of people who will walk with you through life and through hardship as well as times of joy.
Yeah, it's such an important thing.
Yeah. So definitely having a support system. I think having some clarity about your own coping strategies, things that that work for you, whether that is exercise, whether that is prayer and meditation, whether that is baking, things that help you to relax, help you to maybe clear your mind, help you to just kind of be in touch with with yourself and with your emotions. And then I think too, not being afraid to ask for help. So even if you have not entered the stage of suffering, don't be afraid to ask for help, whether that's from someone that you really know, a friend, or that's from a therapist. I'd be remiss to not mention mental health, as a therapist or a grief counselor or a grief group that can really help with that.
Of course. I mean, there is no shame in reaching out for help. And a lot of us feel too proud, but in these moments, it's a unique situation you're in and you haven't been there before, and talking with somebody who has is really important. Yes. Well, this has been a good conversation. We've got more to talk about the rest of this week. So glad you've been here for this part. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.